The master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried. Welcome everyone to Let's Learn with Limbic episode 6, where I analyze my own replays in order to identify my mistakes so that we can both learn from them. Now before we get started, I would like to mention that I did miss last week for an episode, and I do apologize for that. And the reason is, apparently if karma exists, I've done something really atrocious because these past couple of weeks have been absolutely insane for me. It's just been a period where it feels like nothing will actually work. Everything I touch breaks. There's one crisis after another that I have to attend to, and it kind of caused me to lose my mind, apparently, because I thought that the week was like one day earlier than it actually was. I thought Wednesday was Tuesday, so I thought I had an extra day to make this video and upload it, when in reality, that was not the case. And then the next day was Christmas, and I had more things breaking that I had to try and fix, and it was just atrocious. And apparently, I haven't gotten my mind back yet, because this is actually my third time recording this episode. Apparently my recording setup has gotten a little wonky, and I recorded this twice, but apparently I had the program set up to save the file to nowhere. And only after opening up the editing program and trying to find the file and just going, oh my goodness, where is this, did I realize what the problem was. But I had to do it twice, so that was fun. Anyway, let's talk about the quote that I put at the beginning of this video. The master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried. Why did I put that there? The reason is because that's what this entire series really is about, failure. I look at replays of games that I usually lost. I have thrown in a couple of games that I won just to make sure I keep you all guessing, but I promise that most of the time this will feature games that I lose. And even in the games that I won, we look at the things that I did poorly, where I kind of messed up. And that's okay. It's okay to fail sometimes. Do you think that Flash or Tasia or whoever your favorite pro gamer might be has never made any silly mistakes? Do you think they've never lost to a DT rush or something kind of silly like that? Of course they have. But instead of getting mad, instead of blaming balance, well, maybe they blame balance at first, but you know, instead of just frothing at the mouth and posting on forums, they look at their replays and they think, okay, how can I make sure this doesn't happen again, especially in like a pro game, or especially a tournament game, because I definitely would not want to be losing out on money over something like this. And that's what makes them so good. Instead of, apart from their dedication and hours every day of play, you know, and perhaps, if you believe in such a thing, natural talent, it's their persistence, and they're willing to look at what they did wrong in order to improve it. And that's what this series is about. We're not pro gamers. Well, maybe some of you watching are pro gamers, but I'm not a pro gamer, and I'm not anywhere near that. But who knows? Maybe one day I'd like to be one. But if I'm going to do that, I have to be willing to look at what I did wrong, watch these replays, which can make me cringe a couple of times when I really mess up. It's sometimes hard to watch yourself really fail, but it's what you gotta do if you want to become better. And that's just kind of good life advice too, right? Wow, life advice from Limbic Gaming. Expect some big changes going to be coming to the channel. Next video, how to lose weight. Oh dear, I really am losing my mind. It is currently, let's see, 2:37 a.m. Yeah, I'm kind of going a little crazy, so I do apologize if this episode is a little weird. Alright, let's actually talk about the game. That sounds like a good idea. It seems like that's what we're all here for. Now, why has it been a really long time since we've had a Terran versus Protoss Let's Learn with Limbic? The first episode was one, but we haven't had one since then, 5 episodes later, and the reason is because every single time I play Protoss on the ladder, they decide to cheese me. I'm not joking. If it's not Proxy Oracle, it's Proxy Gateway. And if it's not that, it's Proxy Dark Shrine. What is this? And I can't really be posting more videos just saying, oh yeah, here's here my opponent cheesed me. Either I didn't see it coming and I just lost to that, or I did see it coming. Here's what you do in order to prepare against it. Because if you want to know how to beat cheeses, you can just basically Google it. That's not what you come here for, I at least hope. You know, if I did videos about how I lost to cheese, it would be, hey everyone, welcome to Let's Learn with Limbic. Yeah, my opponent did a proxy DT rush and I didn't see it coming and I just lost to that. Alright, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Like, it'd just be bad. But in this game, yes, our opponent does do something like this, but it doesn't end the game. And as you can see from the timer here, it goes on for a little while. So let's just go ahead and speed it up until we get to the good part. Now, normally I would skip to 6 minutes. Apparently I've got to throw that into every single episode, but I just wanted to ramble on, explain why I missed the last episode, talk about how I'm slowly losing my mind, etc. So let's talk about this DT rush in and of itself, okay? This has to do damage, and this is something that I had a really hard time understanding when I was first getting into StarCraft and when I was learning. And I mean, I'm not trying to sound like I'm done learning. I learn new things every day. But when I was a beginner myself, I didn't understand why casters would say, like, this has to do damage. I mean, why does it have to do damage? And the reason is because look at how much gas our opponent has spent on this rush. And that's what's really important for Protoss, is the gas. I mean, yeah, of course, everything they do does require minerals, but so many of their important units are very gas heavy that they really want as much of that as possible. I mean, they want to be building Colossi, and they want to be building Sentries and High Templar, and be getting upgrades and Mothership cores and all that fun stuff. So let's just examine how much gas they've spent. 150 for the Dark Shrine, 100 for the Twilight Council, and then 375 for these 3 Dark Templar. That's a total of 625 gas. Now, that gas could have instead been spent on a Robotics Bay, and a Colossi, and 1/1 upgrades. So by doing this rush, our opponent has slowed themselves down, because they could have had the Robotics Bay probably done by now, a Colossi probably done, or at least almost done, and 1/1 on the way. But instead, they built these 3 Dark Templar. So in order to justify this, they have to do damage to me, in order to put me into either a similar position or a worse position than he has put himself into, if that makes any sense. So let's examine how much damage this manages to do. Now, with Dark Templar, you don't really necessarily have to do crippling damage with them, because the Dark Templar are always going to be useful. They're going to be really useful for harass. You can even put them in your main army, and if your opponent doesn't realize, they'll usually kill at least a few Marines. They're really, really good at cleaning up drops. They're just all around useful, and the reason is because even if you just run one up and your opponent immediately sees it and scans it and then just kills it, that's actually not that bad, because a scan and a Dark Templar cost about the same. And you might be saying, how? A scan's free. Well, a mule harvests 270 minerals before it expires. Okay? And for every scan you use, that's a mule you can't call down. Which means that, in essence, every scan costs 270 minerals, if that makes any sense. So you don't have to do amazing damage. Our opponent did do a lot of damage. They killed 14 workers as a matter of fact. And you can see that they are very ahead in terms of workers. And this looks a lot worse than it actually is. And the reason is because Terran has mules. A mule accounts for, or a mule is worth somewhere between 4 and 6 workers. It kind of depends on who you ask. There's a good argument for any number in between those. But let's just, for the sake of argument here, say a mule is equal to 5 workers. Now that's not counted up here. But since I have 2 orbital commands constantly calling down mules, you can basically just say I have 10 more workers than I actually do, which means that this in essence is 46 workers to 47 instead of 36 to 47. So this is a lot closer than it appears. And, you know, that's just kind of part of how the game works. You might be saying, if you think that mules are kind of unfair, bear in mind that Protoss workers build faster due to Chrono Boost. And in order to just keep up with Protoss, that's why Terran gets mules. Zerg can build many, many workers at once. It's just how the game works. Let me take a drink here. My throat is kind of sore. shouting at a microphone for probably an hour straight will do that. So here I decide, okay, this is actually a good opportunity to attack. Why? Because since I know that my opponent cannot possibly have Colossi or Storm, which they definitely would normally have at this point, that means that their army is going to be relatively weak. Gateway units compared to Marine Marauder Medevac, especially once Marines have Stim and Combat Shield, the gateway units are extremely poor in terms of quality. That's why Protoss usually tries to get like a Colossus out as soon as possible, because they just need to have those higher tech units in order to survive. So as you can see, I managed to clean up most of his army. This Archon's a total boss. It kills 10 Marines on its own. For perspective there, I only had 36 Marines in this attack, so that Archon single-handedly cleaned up a third of that army. But even though this looks like I attacked and I got crushed, I actually would say I came out a little ahead in this fight. Not massively ahead, not like game-winning worth, but I think that this was a good trade for me. And you might ask why. Well, I gave up tons of Marines, and yes, Marines are important to Terran, but I gave up tons of Marines, which are just minerals and they're very easy to replace, for... Oh, it's kitty cameo time. I do apologize if you heard that meow. He does like to talk to me while I'm trying to record. Anyway, Marines are very easy to replace. What's not easy to replace are Archons, Immortals, and Sentries. Remember how I was talking about how important gas is to Protoss? That means that whenever they have to replace units, especially like Sentries, they're cutting away from other units they want to be making. So we killed 2 Sentries. Our Protoss opponent is going to rebuild those, and 2 Sentries is enough gas to make a Colossus. So in other words, we delayed that Colossus significantly, if that makes any sense. And Sentries are something that Protoss does have to remake, and they have to remake them very soon because Protoss wants them to have as much energy as possible. So if you can trade out your Marines for very gas-intensive units from the Protoss, as long as it's not insane, like you don't want to be giving up 100 Marines for a Sentry, but I mean, use common sense. But as long as you can trade away Marines for the very gas-intensive units of Protoss, that's usually a good trade for you as the Terran player. So we're taking our thirds. Our thirds are actually pretty equally timed. You might be thinking, well, no, they're not. You're insane for saying that. Your third is already done, and the Protoss's third is not even halfway complete. And the thing you have to consider is, first of all, this command center has to upgrade into an orbital, which takes a really long time. To give you a perspective, command centers and Nexi take 100 seconds to complete, and transforming a command center into an orbital takes 35 seconds. So in other words, a command center or an orbital command takes 135% of the time that it takes to build a nexus. And of course they have to lift it off and float it all the way over, which takes a while because command centers move very slowly. So even though it looks like I'm very far ahead in my third base timing, the Protoss and I are actually very even. But I move my units forward, I scout the third base. I do lose a couple of units, but that's actually fine. You might be thinking, why didn't you just drop a scan here? And the reason is because, as I mentioned before, a scan basically costs 270 minerals, which means that any time that you can avoid using a scan, it's a good situation for you. I lost, I think, 2 Marines there. That means I essentially spent 100 minerals, whereas if I scanned, I would have spent 270. Now, if we look at my command center energy, you might be saying, it's really high. Wow, Limbic, you're so bad at this game. But in my defense, I actually was keeping it high on purpose because I didn't want my opponent to just be sending a Dark Templar at my army again and again and just picking off Marines and being annoying with that. So I wanted to make sure I always had a scan. This is intentional. Now, this pylon is like right outside of my vision range. I thought that this Dark Templar actually came from this pylon and that he warped it in before I managed to kill it, and I didn't realize it. So this pylon is going to survive for way too long and be really annoying. But yeah, and again, you might be saying, oh, well, that's something you should work on fixing. I don't think it's actually that big of a deal. You can see it's just right outside of my vision range. This is kind of a rare situation that doesn't really happen that often, and I just didn't see it, and I don't think that it's really... I don't think that I like made a huge mistake by not figuring it was there. I think it was a perfectly reasonable assumption that this Dark Templar came from the pylon over here. Alright, so I decided to do kind of a doom drop here. And the reason for that is, as Terran, you always want to be kind of slowing down your opponent. You want to, try to pick off a base if you can. You want to be trying to pick off tech, and I do manage to do that here. I'm going to kill our opponent's robotics facility and the robotics bay, which is really, really important for Terran. And the reason is because in the Terran versus Protoss matchup, there are two big threats, really, and they go by the name of Colossi and Storm. Now, as Terran, you basically have to answer both of these threats if your opponent has them. You have to be getting Vikings to deal with the Colossi, and you have to be getting Ghosts to deal with the Storm. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'd like to finish this thought, though. So, getting both Colossi and Vikings is really hard. Those are both really expensive units. It's very difficult for Terran to be getting both of those and still getting a good enough army to fight the rest of the Protoss, gateway units and the Immortals and all that stuff, especially the charge lots, at the same time. Which means that if you can ever eliminate one of those threats, you're in good shape as Terran. So I thought I had eliminated the possibility of Colossi here from my opponent, which meant that I thought I only had to worry about Storm and that I could delay my Viking production. Now I am starting it here because I already have enough medevacs, but I know that I can go ahead and wait a little longer before I get my second starport, or at least I thought. Now, when I did the attack, this was still warping in. I didn't realize this was a second robotics facility. I thought this was just a gateway. Now, this is actually very huge because if you kill both the robotics facility and the robo bay, before your opponent can start building Colossi again, they must first rebuild the robotics facility, which takes 65 seconds. Then they start the robotics bay, which takes another 65 seconds. And then they can start Colossi. Which meant that, that's a really long time. But they already had the robotics facility already completed, so they were able to start the robotics bay right away, and they started a second robotics facility. So at the same time, at a point in time when I thought that my opponent was not going to have any capability of producing Colossus, he's actually going to be producing them 2 at a time. And this is actually going to be what loses me the game. I'll go ahead and say that right now. Now, losing this medevac to these cannons, I lost a medevac full of units, and that is definitely significant, but it wasn't game losing. I think that's a moment where a lot of people will watch their replays and say, oh man, I lost a medevac full of units to those cannons. That was so idiotic of me. That's why I lost this game. And while it's true that, especially in much lower economy games, that can be a game-losing mistake, in a game like this, we already have 3 fully saturated bases. I'm getting my 4th. That's only 10 supply of units. It's really not that big of a deal. You can see I'm actually 50 supply ahead of my opponents right now, which means that I'm doing very well for myself. Now, you can't always look at supply to know who's ahead, but whenever there's a very significant disparity, that means that whoever is in the lead is actually doing very well. Now, if this were like 114 supply to 120 supply, that actually wouldn't mean anything, because you always expect Terran to be a little ahead in supply because they're building Marines and Marauders constantly, whereas Protoss is usually only building, Colossi or Storm, and only warping in gateway units when they think it's necessary. So it's just normal for Terran to be a little ahead in supply, but it's not normal for them to be this far ahead. So I am definitely winning the game at this point. Now, this engagement I'm actually going to lose, and there's a couple things I would blame on that. First of all, my opponent gets some really great force fields. Second of all, these medevacs I managed to kind of mess up. Now, I don't want my opponent to be able to attack them with this Archon, because Archons deal a lot of damage, medevacs have very little health, and they do splash damage. And as you can see, medevacs just tend to really clump themselves up, and it's far easier to just boost them like over here to safety than it is to try and split them up while also microing your army down here. Plus, I figured if they were over here, then I would be able to load up my units and then just move over here if I needed to. Unfortunately, I misclicked with these medevacs. What I actually did was, while trying to click down here, I clicked on the minimap instead. So the medevacs thought I wanted them to go all the way up here, which is basically the exact opposite of what I wanted them to do. You can see that there. And that actually is huge. It seemed like it was just a few seconds there, but that was a few seconds that those medevacs were not healing. And that is very, very significant because Terran units have very little health, especially Marines. Marines have 55 health with Combat Shield, and of course they're going to be dealing 10 damage to themselves with Stim. Compare that to the Zealot, 150 health if you count the shield. Compare that to an Archon, 360 health if you count the shield. You know, Immortal, 300. You get the point. The kind of way you counter such low health is by having your units constantly being healed. That's why medevacs are so important for Terran. Imagine just, you know, as a little bit of a thought experiment, if you ever feel like doing this, try building a Terran army against a Protoss army, but with no medevacs, and you will just see how much worse, how laughably bad Terran is without medevacs. So while they were just kind of dancing around here, they were essentially not there. They were not healing. And that's how my army kind of gets crushed here. Of course, these units back here not actually doing anything does help. The fact that he did build lots of Immortals in order to chew through the Marauders alive also does help. But I think that those two things are, the force fields and the medevacs not doing anything, are the two major influencers to that army, to the outcome of that engagement. Now, even still, I'm actually still ahead. I'm about 30 supply ahead of my opponent, which is not as big as it was before, but it is still big. And that disparity is going to grow even larger. You can see I have my 4th base done. I'm floating it over. The 4th base for my Protoss opponent hasn't even started. And yes, it's okay for Protoss to take their expansions later than Terran, but not this much later. And you can see that supply disparity is just growing ever so much larger. I'm going to actually get maxed out here very soon. I've added on a lot more barracks. I have the Ghost Academy on the way because I thought that my opponent was probably going to say, okay, you killed my potential to go for Colossus. I'm just going to go for Storm now, and then add on Colossi later when I can. I thought there was no way that he would just rebuild these robotics facilities and bays and then start going ham on the Colossi production. Had I known this, I would have gotten the 2nd starport a lot earlier, and I would have been producing Vikings a lot sooner. Now, I am producing Vikings anyway, because as I mentioned, I already have enough medevacs, but I'm going to get maxed out here, and I'm going to have 4 Vikings total. And during this big fight that's going to come out, only 2 of them are going to be in the actual battle. Now, in this battle, my opponent is going to have 4 Colossus. And in any situation where not only you have very few Vikings, but there are actually more Colossi than Vikings as Terran, you are not in a good spot. So here I decided I'm actually going to go up this ramp. That was foolish, and I actually do realize this in the game. But say my opponent has Storm, this actually could have lost me the game. Imagine a Storm on this army right here. That would have just annihilated everything. Luckily I realized my mistake, and I just go ahead and back on out of there. Now, in the last episode of Let's Learn with Limbic, I talked about engagements and how important they are. I decided I'm going to actually, I wisened up a little here. I'm going to try to force my opponent to take a poor engagement. So I could just sit at the bottom of this ramp, and I'm going to try to force my opponent to come down here to me. Now, why is this a good engagement for me? It means that my opponent's army is going to be clumped up, which might not seem like that big of a deal, especially since I have no splash damage in this army, except for these Widow Mines. But the reason why it's huge is it's going to mean that these Zealots are going to have a hard time getting on top of my army. Some of the, like Archons and Stalkers are not going to all be firing at once. I'm going to have the much better concave. It's just a very good idea to try to force your opponent's army to be clumped up whenever you can. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate to you why this was a good engagement for me. And indeed, I would have actually won the game here if I had a proper Viking count. You can see I'm actually maxed out now, but I have 4 Vikings on the map. As you can see, I have 4 Vikings. My opponent has 4 Colossi. That is nowhere near enough. You usually want to be doubling your opponent's Colossi count, or even tripling, really. I would have liked to have 16 Vikings in this army, especially since my opponent was going so heavy on the Colossi. But instead, I'm making ghosts. I assumed that my opponent was going for Storm. With, I had reasons to believe it, but not a lot of reason. I never checked. I never saw High Templar. In fact, the only thing I've seen to this point were Colossi, and this is my big failure in this game. Now, I would like to just take a look at these Zealots. Do you see how these Zealots are kind of just sitting around here dancing, not actually engaging my army? That's why it's a good idea to try to force your opponent to go down a ramp like that. But yeah, just watch these Colossi. Look how much damage they're able to do on my army. Look at this, 9 kills, 8 kills, 6 kills. That's just the killing blows that they got. That doesn't account for all the damage they've done on their own. So right now I'm realizing, oh my gosh, my opponent went for Colossi, not Storm. Or at least I should be realizing that, but what am I building instead? More Ghosts. I'm thinking, for some reason, even though I still have not seen Storm from my opponent, I'm still thinking my opponent must be going for Storm. And again, this is my big failure. This is my big mistake. I don't know why I was so insistent on this. So he sends some Dark Templar to harass and be annoying. This allows him to get into position with his army. And look, this army is not impressive for Protoss, really. Like, this is not that scary, especially for 20 minutes in the game. Like, really? I should be able to absolutely crush this army. By the way, my dog's squeaking his chew toy right now, so sorry if that's annoying you. All the animals like to make sure that they get a little cameo on my videos. But yeah, I mean, for 20 minutes in the game, this should not be an army that I would lose to. But it is. And, I mean, okay, now I have enough Vikings to deal with the Colossi count. Kinda. It's still really slow. I have 6 Vikings total against 4 Colossi. It's just way too slow. They were able to completely destroy my army before I even came close to destroying them all. And I do manage to destroy them all, but it's just too late. And that's something I guess that can kind of be the big lesson of this video is don't just assume that your opponent is going to be doing something, even if it seems like the only viable option that they have. Scout. Make sure you know what they're actually doing. Go ahead and drop a scan on their army, and then if you see, oh my goodness, they actually have 0 High Templar, just start the Viking production, which is what I should have done here. Had I done that, I would have won this game. Easily. Easily. It wouldn't have been any contest. It would have looked completely one-sided. There probably would have been comments about how imbalanced Terran is from my opponent. But that's not what happened. So that was this episode of Let's Learn with Limbic. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully I did not have to record this a 4th time. Oh my goodness. Then I can actually go to sleep and it will be wonderful. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all next time. The squeaky toy. Please tell me you're actually recording. Oh, what a relief.